Hey, History Geeks, it's me, Miss Terrell. Starting off period 7. Woo! Really excited to be here. 1898 well, 1890 technically, to 1945. So, in less than one lifetime, Americans went from buggies to automobiles to airplanes, and within 3 decades, they experienced two horrific wars, World War I and World War II, and of course, the worst depression in American history. In this era rather was shaped by continued industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. The role and size of government, especially on the federal level, expanded to meet the challenges of the boom and bust economy, and of course, two global wars. Debates over the role of government, science and religion, culture and ethnic diversity also created anxiety and conflicts during this time period. That included the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. In foreign policy, the road from non-involvement, meaning we're going to be on the outside looking in and we're just going to take care of ourselves, to international leadership was unsure, reversed, and then reluctantly accepted by Americans. This period begins with the Spanish-American War in 1898 and ends with World War II in 1945. Politically, it's known as the Progressive Era. It had its roots in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. We also see FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the New Deal. The New Deal coalition, built in the 1930s, continues to help shape politics today. Our key concepts for period 7: governmental, political, and social organizations struggle to address the effects of large-scale industrialization, economic uncertainty, and related social changes such as urbanization and mass migration. We also see or undergo a revolution in communication and transportation technology, which helped to create a new mass culture and spread quote-unquote modern values and ideas, even as cultural conflicts began even though cultural conflicts between groups increased under the pressure of migration, obviously world wars, and economic distress. Global conflicts over resources, territories, and ideologies helped to renew debates over the nation's values and its role in the world, while simultaneously propelling the U.S. into a dominant international military, political, cultural, and economic position. So the U.S. becomes a world power between this time frame, 1898 to 1917. We are Anglo-Saxons. We must obey our blood and occupy new markets, and, if necessary, new lands. Senator Albert Beveridge, April 27, 1898. Our form of government, our traditions, our present interest, and our future welfare all forbid our entering upon a career of conquest. William Jennings Bryan, December 13, 1898. I think you can see two different views on Americans' take on whether or not the United States should become a world power or not. They do decide to go with it, and we'll see what happens. Since the 1790s, U.S. foreign policy had centered on expanding westward, protecting U.S. interests abroad, and limited foreign influence in the Americas. The booming industrial economy after the Civil War saw a major shift in U.S. relations with the rest of the world. We go from being pretty much isolated to becoming a world power and controlling territories in both the Caribbean as well as the Philippines. We also start to see the development of a new concept called New Imperialism. Hold on, Griffey. Essentially, why can't you see me? Okay, that's better. So essentially, imperialism is either acquiring territory or gaining control over political or economic life of other countries. International Darwinism essentially means demonstrating strength in the international arena. This is an offshoot or an expansion of Manifest Destiny. We see missionaries going abroad and essentially claiming it's their divine duty, their religious duty, to spread Christianity. This becomes a major reason why this is important. Politicians grasp the call to imperialism as well as a strong naval force, and of course, popular press. We start our voyage in imperialism with the Spanish-American War. Here's the causes. 1, the Cuban Revolt. General Wheeler, otherwise known as the Butcher. And number 2, the Yellow Press, sensationalization of reporting stories. Cause number 3, the Loan Letter in 1898, which was highly critical of President McKinley and considered an insult. Number 4, the sinking of the USS Maine. This happens on the 15th of February, 1898, and suddenly, when the USS Maine suddenly explodes, killing 260 Americans. And then, of course, the Teller Amendments. We're going to talk more in class about the Spanish-American War. I have a documentary that I want to show you. But let me just jump to the end and talk about the Treaty of Peace, which happened December 10th, 1898. 1, recognized Cuban independence. 2, U.S. acquisition of 2 Spanish islands, Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and then Guam out in the Pacific. 3, the U.S. acquisition of the Philippines in return for payment to Spain in the form of $20 million. The Philippines was not excited about it. Emilio Aguinaldo led guerrilla fighters against U.S. control. And in that case, over the course of 3 years, thousands of lives were lost. And this, of course, came to an end in 1902. Let's talk a little bit about the insular cases. Here's the question. Does the Constitution follow the flag? Meaning, does the Constitution follow what policies the United States wants to engage in? The answer, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a series of cases between 1901 and 1903 that constitutional rights were not automatically extended to territorial possessions, and that the power to decide whether or not to grant such rights actually belonged to Congress. Let's talk a little bit about the Platt Amendment in 1901. U.S. troops remained in Cuba from 1898 to 1901. Congress made the withdrawal of troops conditional on Cuban acceptance of terms. These terms were that 1, Cuba would never sign a treaty with a foreign power that impaired its independence. 2, to permit or allow the U.S. to intervene in Cuba's affairs to preserve its independence and maintain law and order. 3, allow the U.S. to maintain naval bases in Cuba, including 1 permanent base, otherwise known as Gitmo, which is still there. And then Cuba would become a U.S. proctorate. Other foreign policies at this time definitely were dabbling in China. We had an open door policy with China. In 1890, Russia, Japan, Great Britain, France, and Germany had all established what we call spheres of influence in China, meaning we could dominate, meaning that they could dominate trade and investment within their sphere and shut out competitors. John Hay, who at the time was the Secretary of State, not wanting to get closed out of access of Chinese trade, decided to create what he called an open door policy. Essentially, with the open door, all nations would have equal trade privileges in China. No nation rejected the concept, and Hay declared that all had accepted the open door policy. This was hailed by the press as a diplomatic triumph. All right, let's talk a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt and his big stick policy. Teddy Roosevelt, in 1901, McKinley was fatally shot. President McKinley was assassinated, and his vice president, who was Teddy Roosevelt, and also Teddy Roosevelt was the hero of the Spanish-American War, essentially becomes the president. And his bumper sticker was "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Essentially, this is a very aggressive foreign policy in which we sought to build the reputation of the U.S. as a really big, great world power. During Teddy Roosevelt's reign, we see the completion of the Panama Canal, which I have a great documentary on that we'll watch, started in 1904 and completed in 1914. Previously attempted by the French, but they just could not pull it off, and we absolutely did. Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, so essentially instead of letting Europeans intervene in Latin America, which essentially is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, Teddy Roosevelt said absolutely the U.S. would do that. Also, the U.S. would send gunboats to Latin American countries that were delinquent in paying its debts. Another foreign policy that emerges at this time is under President Taft and is called dollar diplomacy. Between 1909 and 1913, the U.S. did not carry a big stick. Taft adopted a foreign policy that was mildly expansionist, but depended more on investors' dollars than on the Navy's battleships. It did, however, promote U.S. trade by supporting American enterprises abroad, obviously known as dollar diplomacy. His policy didn't go as planned because of growing anti-imperialism in both the U.S. as well as overseas. Wilson and foreign affairs. Woodrow Wilson, who becomes president in 1913-1917, he promised what he called a moral approach to foreign affairs. He imposed imperialism, he imposed the big stick, and the dollar diplomacy policies. He had limited success applying a high moral standard to foreign relations, he wanted to correct what he saw was wrongful policies of the past. In the Philippines, we see the Jones Act pass in 1916, which granted full territorial status to the country. Secondly, guaranteed the Bill of Rights and universal male suffrage to all Filipino citizens. Third, it promised independence for the Philippines as soon as a stable government was formed. Lastly, under Wilson, Puerto Rico in 1917 was granted U.S. citizenship to all the inhabitants and provided for limited self-government. Okay, that's what we got for today. Come back tomorrow. We're going to start talking about the Progressive Era.